We arrived at the campsite after a long drive through deserted roads, seemingly devoid of life beyond the mountains and trees all around. The afternoon sun was beating down, touching my skin like a gentle wave, but there was something in the air that made me feel uneasy. Ayana sat beside me, her eyes searching, scanning everything with a determined look on her face. She said we would only be here for a day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We arrived at the campsite, and I immediately realized that I was the only person of color in a crowd of light-skinned faces. It was a strange feeling, and I couldn't deny that it made me feel alone. Although I didn't say it, everything around me, from the fancy cars to the unfamiliar stairs, made me feel out of place. Ayana didn't mind. She wasn't the type to be easily swayed by other people's opinions, and maybe that was why I loved her. But I couldn't stop thinking about this place, about this forest. An uneasy feeling kept clinging to me, making it impossible for me to relax, even though we had come here to relax. Lila and Daniel, Ayana's close friends, greeted us with such enthusiasm that I couldn't help but smile. Everything around us seemed to be in a state of peace, something like a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking. Not this place, but me. As we toured the luxury camper Lila had prepared, I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. At least for the next few hours, I wouldn't have to worry about bears, snakes, or anything else Ayana and I had joked about. This camper was truly a mobile home, with all the amenities of a small apartment. However, as everyone prepared to set out on the trail, I felt something was off. Even though Ayana had reassured me that everything would be fine, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease in my heart. Lila and Daniel were so enthusiastic, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. My footsteps echoed in the silence, as if every step was being watched by something invisible, yet so close. The group began to move, guided by Vincent and Erica, the tour guides. I tried to engage in a conversation with Brock about fishing, but my mind was still haunted by the dark shadows of the trees, the shadows that moved across my blurred vision. Ayana kept walking beside me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, from the shadows, from among the dense woods. Then suddenly, the ground began to shake. The sounds of trees breaking, the terrible noise that made me lose my footing. Everything seemed to be torn apart. Trees fell, the ground softened, and the mist began to gather like a thick curtain. The screams of people around added to the chaos. I held Ayana's hand, feeling her warmth, but I couldn't seem to keep calm. The earthquake was not just the panic of the land, but also the breaking of something deep inside me. Then, as if nothing had happened, everything stopped. People stood there, gasping for breath, as if they couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The distant car alarm sounded, but it did nothing to dispel the chill that was enveloping us. The fog continued to thicken, and the air became heavy and cold. Something, maybe a sign, was coming. I felt an invisible force pushing us forward, forcing us to keep going. Vincent and Erica tried to keep their composure, but I could see in their eyes a fear that none of us dared to admit. And then, for a split second, I saw it, a tall, dark figure, standing still in the mist. Its green eyes glowed like two lamps, glowing in the darkness. No one said anything, but we all sensed it. Danger was approaching. When I turned back to Ayana, I saw the panic in her eyes. Run, she didn't say, but I knew it. And I ran. But not just because I was afraid. It was because I sensed that if we stopped, it would come. And as we ran, the shadow began to move too. We ran, no one said a word. We just held hands, running through narrow paths, through fallen trees, through thick fog. Every step I took felt like I was entering a bad dream from which I couldn't wake up. Ayana was still holding my hand, her eyes glistening in the dim light, but I knew she was as scared as I was. As we ran towards the campsite, the air became colder and colder, to the point where I could feel the air freeze as I breathed in. Our footsteps echoed in the silence, as if all other sounds had disappeared, leaving only the pounding of our hearts. The fog grew thicker and thicker, as if it were closing in on us from all sides. The figure was still behind us, showing no signs of stopping. It moved faster, not running like us, but gliding through the air, light as a black wind. Its eyes glowed in the mist, like a predator staring at its prey. Every time I dared to look back, it got closer, until I could no longer bear to look. But it's not just that shadow. A strange sound came from deep within the forest. It was a strange sound, neither animal nor human. It was like a sigh, but not the breathing of a living person. It had a dark tone, as if something living in the darkness was breathing cold breaths. The sound gradually came closer, clearer, as if it were chasing us. The lights from the camper van gradually appeared ahead, but we still weren't there. Everyone in the group was still trying to keep up the pace, but I could see the worry on their faces, the fatigue starting to show. And then, something strange happened. As we passed a large tree, Ayana tripped. I turned around, intending to pull her up, but I heard that breathing, this time close to me, as if someone was standing behind me. A cold wind suddenly blew, carrying with it a pungent stench that choked me. I turned around, unable to see anything but darkness. And then, from the mist, a figure appeared. It stood there, unmoving, staring at us with its glowing, all-consuming eyes. It was not a man, not an animal, but something indescribable. It was over 7 feet tall, its body dark as a ghost, shapeless, but I could feel its presence. Its glowing eyes were unlike any I had ever seen, like flames burning in the darkness. And then it moved, slowly, but faster than we expected. Its eyes never left us, and its steps made the ground tremble beneath our feet. The trees around us swayed, as if invisible arms were reaching out from the darkness to wrap around us. Ayana pulled me, her eyes filled with worry, but I couldn't take my eyes off that shadow. I felt like there was an invisible force pulling me closer to it. The hypnosis was strange, I couldn't explain it. I pulled her to run faster, but that shadow was still there, following us closely, leaving no room for error. A horrible scream came from behind. Daniel, Lila, Kaylee, and Brock turned to look, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the figure, and I felt fear rising in my body. Ayana gasped, pulling me forward. She didn't dare turn around, but I could feel the anxiety in her every move. We ran, but it was as if the space around us had changed. The shadows of the trees and the path became blurry, making it impossible to tell which way was right. We had passed a small swamp, but I could no longer recognize the area. There was no sound except our labored breathing. The ground beneath our feet seemed to soften, to give way as we walked. The light from the camper was near, but the shadow did not let go. It was still there, too close, but when I dared to look back again, all I saw was absolute darkness. Just then, a scream tore through the air. Lila. The group stopped. When I turned around, I saw Lila lying on the ground, her eyes closed, but her mouth still open in agony. The figure, not just standing still now, had come closer, and it was no longer a shadowy silhouette. I could see every detail of its body. Its skin like charcoal, its long arms, and its joints sticking out like dry twigs. But its eyes still burned like deadly flames. I couldn't move, couldn't help. In my mind, there was only one thought. If we didn't leave now, we would never leave this place again. That night, the hospital corridor was strangely quiet. It was so quiet that all I could hear was the soft click of my shoes on the tiled floor. The cold fluorescent lights overhead flickered, adding to the eerie feeling of a hospital at night. As a doctor accustomed to late-night shifts, I was not easily affected by the atmosphere, but this time, something was wrong. I had just received orders from my superiors to go down to the basement to retrieve some medical supplies for an emergency surgery. Hospital basements had long been known as places no one wanted to go alone, especially at night. Narrow corridors with dim lighting, dark corners hidden behind old doors, and eerie noises coming from the gas and water pipes. But a mission was a mission, and I could not delay. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. There was a ding as the elevator doors opened. Inside, a woman stood silently. She was wearing a pale blue hospital gown. Her hair was messy, and her deep eyes stared ahead as if she was thinking about something. The light in the elevator reflected off her pale skin, making her look more like a shadow than a person. I stepped in, forcing a smile. There were only the two of us in the elevator. I pressed the basement button and realized she hadn't pressed the button for the floor before. This surprised me a little. Maybe she was planning on going to the basement, too? In this hospital, patients were allowed to roam the grounds for relaxation, but they had to be back in their rooms by 10 p.m. It was almost 11 p.m. The air in the elevator grew heavier as it began to descend. I could feel the slight vibrations as it passed a floor. The woman standing next to me said nothing, but her presence made me uneasy. I glanced at her wrist and saw the green bracelet. That reassured me. She was a survivor. As the elevator stopped and the doors opened, dim light flooded in from the basement. I could see metal shelves lining the hallway, flickering light bulbs swaying on the ceiling. Suddenly, a figure appeared in my line of sight. It was a man. He hobbled toward the elevator, his feet dragging on the floor with an unpleasant sound. I recognized him immediately. It was the patient who had died yesterday. I was the one who had performed the botched surgery on him. My heart was pounding. Cold sweat was breaking out on my forehead. On his wrist, a red bracelet glinted in the dim light. Without thinking, I quickly pressed the close button. The man was only a few feet away from the elevator doors when they closed, blocking his way inside. The elevator shuddered slightly, then began to move upward. My heart was pounding, and I struggled to control my breathing. Suddenly, the voice of the woman beside me rang out, breaking the eerie silence. She asked me, her voice full of questions and a bit of reproach. I pointed to the elevator door, explaining about the red bracelet I had seen on the man's wrist. It was a sign of death, and I knew that better than anyone. The woman did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and when I turned to look at her, her deep eyes seemed to see right through me. Then, in that moment, she slowly raised her wrist. A strange smile spread across her lips, and I felt the air around me freeze. On her wrist, a bright red bracelet. I stood still, my eyes glued to the red bracelet on her wrist. My heart stopped, and a chill ran down my spine. That bracelet, it couldn't be. She was standing right next to me, conscious, alive. But that mark, red, there was no mistaking it. It was the color of the dead. The space in the elevator seemed to shrink. I could hear my own heavy breathing, mixed with the slight vibration of the elevator as it continued to rise. The woman said nothing, just looked at me with deep eyes and a strange smile on her pale face. The silence was not like that of a human, but like a bottomless void, sucking in all my sounds and breaths. The elevator doors opened again as it stopped at the top floor. Light from the hallway flooded in, but it did nothing to ease the unease in my heart. The woman did not move, did not leave the elevator, and neither did I. Her presence was like a shadow that could not be escaped. I tried to calm myself down, stepping out of the elevator, but I could feel her eyes still on me. The doors closed behind me, and the sound of the elevator continued moving, carrying her away somewhere. Or maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong. I stood in the empty hallway, my legs shaking. The hallway leading to the hospital rooms was dark, lit only by a few flickering lights. I tried to concentrate on my task, but all I could see in my mind was the image of that woman, her strange smile, and the blood-red bracelet. Then I heard footsteps, slowly, steadily, as if someone were walking toward me from down the hall. But when I turned around, there was no one. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer. I couldn't explain it, but part of me knew I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered, then went out. I was plunged into darkness, and all I could hear was the sound of footsteps, clearer than ever. They sounded from all around me, as if dozens of people were walking around me, but no one appeared. A voice whispered right next to my ear, soft but enough to make me shiver. "You shouldn't have closed the elevator door." I turned around, but there was no one. My heart was pounding, and I felt like my legs were giving out. The whisper was not my imagination. It was so real that I could feel the cold breath on my ear. In the darkness, I saw a faint light at the end of the hallway. I didn't want to go there, but my feet felt like they were being pulled by an invisible force. I walked heavily towards the light, my hands gripping the cold wall. As I got closer, I realized that the light was coming from a room, the door slightly opened, revealing a dim gap. In the room, there was a hospital bed. On it, a figure lay motionless. As I walked closer, I realized it was the man I had seen in the basement, the man with the red bracelet. But this time, he was not lying still. His eyes were wide open, staring at me. And then a hoarse, pained voice rang out from the darkness. "You shouldn't let her go." The lights in the room went out as soon as the sentence ended, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around in panic, and the face of the woman on the elevator appeared before my eyes, the red bracelet glinting in the darkness. The night shift at Rosewood General Hospital was always quiet, almost too quiet. Accustomed to the silence of the night shift, the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady beep of the heart monitor felt like background music. But around 3 a.m., something strange changed. The air felt compressed, the darkness became thicker, and the silence was so sharp that I could hear my own breathing. It felt like something invisible was waiting, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. That night, I worked as I always did. I was assigned to the surgical floor, where most of the patients were either sedated or asleep. The hallways were long and empty, and the only sound was the crunch of old tiles under my feet. Occasionally, the coffee maker in the break room made a faint hum, providing only companionship. At 2:57 a.m., as I sat writing notes in a patient's chart, the overhead lights suddenly flickered. It was just a quick flash, nothing special, but then the monitors at my nurse's station began to flicker, going dark for a few heartbeats before coming back on. I stared at them in confusion. Power outages were rare in this hospital, and the backup power system usually kicked in immediately. Just then, I heard a strange sound. A soft, wet slap echoed down the hallway from room 312, the empty post-op room. It was the kind of sound you'd hear when a mop was dragged across a wet floor, or something alive moving. It kept repeating, like a heavy foot stomping on the floor. The strange feeling made me unable to sit still. I picked up the flashlight and decided to go check. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and the closer I got, the colder the air became. Room 312 was still closed, but the lights on the ceiling kept flashing, as if something was wrong inside. I pushed the door open with my foot, holding the flashlight high in my hand, trying to illuminate the space before me. The bed in the room was empty, the sheets strewn across the floor, but the wet noise continued, now coming from the corner near the window. I stepped in, my heart pounding in my chest, and held the flashlight toward the corner of the room where the sound was coming from. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. A figure was hunched over in the corner of the room, its back to me. It was wearing a hospital gown, but the material was soaked through, stuck to its skin with something black and slimy. As I looked, the figure moved violently and made a strange cracking sound, like someone was gnawing at cartilage. I stepped back, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and I called out softly, "Hello?" Just as I finished speaking, the figure suddenly stopped, and the strange sound stopped. It slowly turned its head to look at me, and in that moment, I felt my stomach tighten. The person's face was no longer a human face. It was just a horrible mess. Flesh hung loosely from the face, patches of skin falling away to reveal the bones and muscles underneath. One eye was gone, leaving an empty socket, blood oozing from it. Its mouth was full of blood, jagged pieces of flesh still stuck to jagged teeth. It smiled at me. A cold wind blew through the hallway, and I felt my heart stop. The figure didn't just stand there. It slowly moved toward me, its steps jerky as if it had no control over its body. Suddenly, I noticed something else in its hand, a severed arm, the fingers still twitching. The wedding ring on that hand reflected the light in the dark room, and I recognized it. It was the ring of the surgeon who had been working late that day. My stomach clenched with fear. A sense of doom rose within me. I couldn't breathe. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think of anything else but getting out of there. As I ran through the wards, I saw more than the strange figure in room 312. I saw other shadows, distorted, unimaginable shapes. A man moved despite his body being split in two, his chest exposed, dragging a scalpel in his hand. A woman in a bloody hospital gown crawled on all fours, her head bobbing and giggling, the sound echoing, distorted, haunting. My breath hitched as I ran back to the nurse's station. The doors slammed shut behind me, and I locked them. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone, dialing security. But the line rang strangely, and no one answered. By now, all I could hear was static, and then a faint whisper. "They see you." The lights in the nurse's station flickered, and when they came back on, I was no longer alone. Standing across the table was a man in surgical scrubs. He looked normal at first, but as I looked closer, blood began to seep through his mask, dripping slowly to the floor, as if on purpose. His eyes were black holes, endless and hungry. Before I could scream, he lunged across the table and grabbed me with hands as cold as ice. He gripped me tightly, pulling me closer, and when I looked into his mouth, I realized it was no human mouth. Rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like those of a monster, were gaping. The last thing I saw before everything went black was him leaning down to my face, and the wet chewing sound filled my ears. When I woke up, I was no longer at the nurse's station. My vision was blurry, and I felt a dull ache from my neck to my head. It felt like I was in a never-ending nightmare. The room around me was completely different. Everything was dark, except for the faint shadows that passed through the corners of my vision. I had no idea where I was, no idea how much time had passed. The coldness seeped into my bones, and I began to feel a presence around me. My mind was spinning, trying to convince myself that I was just dreaming, but as soon as I blinked, I realized that everything was real. This room did not resemble a hospital room. It was more like an abandoned dungeon, with damp walls and no windows. I found myself lying on an old hospital bed, my hands and feet tied to it. The dim light from the ceiling flickered, adding to the feeling of suffocation and inescapability. Something whispered in the darkness. A soft, steady, yet sinister sound, like the ones I had heard before, back in room 312. A low chuckle came from the corner of the room, low and drawn out, as if a monster was standing right next to me, watching my every move. I couldn't see anything but darkness, but I could clearly sense the presence of something that didn't belong to this world. Suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing from the hallway. But when I tried to look outside, my eyes couldn't catch a glimpse of anything. I could feel the cold, the endless cold piercing every cell in my body. Every step, every sound made me feel as if I was being watched, being waited for. After a while, the door opened, and a figure walked in. It was just a shadow, no face. But I could feel the gaze, pitch-black eyes, no light, just darkness and hunger. He didn't move, but I could feel the presence approaching. "It's time," the deep voice said, sending shivers down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run away, but my body couldn't move. There was only coldness and darkness all around. My arms couldn't move, but I could clearly feel his hand on my shoulder, the feeling so cold that it felt like we were standing in an eternal winter night. What I couldn't see clearly, but I could feel, was that he was doing something. A feeling of emptiness, a feeling that I couldn't explain. Every sound in this room seemed to be muffled, but I could hear my own breathing. Each breath was rapid, but unable to escape. As I felt myself sinking into darkness, another door opened. Another person entered. This time, not a shadow, but a man dressed in surgical scrubs. His face was unremarkable except for his eyes. Dark eyes like abysses. He stood there, looking at me without saying anything. His body seemed normal, but I could clearly feel the strangeness in his every movement. "You can't get out," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "It's time you joined them." My mind was still clear, but I couldn't do anything. My hands were clenched. My body was glued to the bed. I couldn't cry, couldn't call for help. A complete paralysis enveloped me, as memories of the ghosts in the hospital suddenly flooded back. Distorted, grotesque figures, with bodies no longer intact, still hovered around me. The light flickered again, this time strangely bright, as if there was a new light, but not a normal light. The darkness seemed to become heavier, as if a black curtain was covering the space. I tried to reach up, but my body was still paralyzed. My eyes searched for an escape, but saw only endless darkness. The voice rang out again, this time stronger. "You can't go out. You're part of us." My eyes slowly opened. The dim light made me realize something unbelievable. The ghosts I thought I had avoided were now right in front of me. The room felt oppressive, impossible to escape. I knew I was trapped, and though I couldn't move, I knew something was coming. The Wisconsin night. The highway is quiet, only the sound of truck engines echoing in the quiet space. Each heavy tire roll on the road, bringing with it an eerie silence. I am a truck driver, making deliveries across states, but tonight, something is different. I have walked this road countless times, but this time it felt different. The wind blew through the trees on the side of the road, rustling them, but it did not lessen the gloom. There was not a soul, just me and the truck. I turned on the radio, trying to dispel the heavy feeling in the air. The soft songs helped me relax a little, but the feeling of unease still haunted me. As I turned onto a steep road that I was all too familiar with, suddenly, from a distance, I noticed two cars blocking the road. I slowed down, suspecting that something was wrong. As I got closer, I realized they were police officers. One of them walked up and waved me to stop. I released the gear shift, got out of the car, and walked over to them. "What's going on?" I asked. "I have a delivery to make this morning. How long will it take?" The policeman glanced ahead, where the road was dimly lit by darkness. "No one will be using this road anymore. You can turn around and take the other route if you are in a hurry. We have a situation here," he said, his voice filled with concern. I looked ahead, trying to make sense of what was happening. The road was deserted, save for the reflections of police cars on the pavement. "What's the situation?" I asked, feeling my unease growing. The policeman hesitated, as if trying to find a way to explain. "Something is blocking the way and won't budge," he said, his expression tense. I didn't think much of it, just figured it might be a deer or some other animal. "Can't you just use your headlights to scare it away? It'll move on its own, won't it?" I protested. He looked at me, his concern growing more evident. "Not an ordinary animal," he said, his voice shaking. A strange feeling crept into my heart. I couldn't understand what was happening. The police seemed more scared than calm, and that indescribable feeling followed me like a ghost. I nodded, trying to calm myself down, and asked, "So, what can I do?" He glanced at me, then bowed his head and whispered, "Use your truck. Maybe scare it into moving into the woods to clear a path." I slowly walked back to the truck, still unable to shake the feeling of anxiety that was rising in my mind. Everything around me seemed to be engulfed in endless darkness. Strange noises from the woods, constant rustling, made it impossible for me to concentrate. Police headlights were illuminating the road, but in the darkness something waited. I turned on the truck's headlights and started moving forward. Every meter I walked seemed to deepen the gloom. The cold wind blew, making me shiver. I couldn't help but think of what the police had said. This is no ordinary animal. Why would a deer or a wild animal frighten them so much? This made me feel even more uneasy. As I slowly drove down the hill, I could see the darkness growing darker, as if it were swallowing the road. The streetlights were not bright enough to dispel the gloom. Each heavy turn of the wheels made the space around me more blurry. Suddenly I saw it, standing on the left side, very close to the edge of the road. A creature, not the animal I had expected. It stood like a huge shadow, motionless. The shape was tall, and when I looked closely, it was unlike any animal I had ever seen. Its shape was like a human silhouette, but it was so tall, so thin, so strange that it was impossible to identify. I tried not to let the panic rise inside me, but I couldn't stop looking. It stood there, silent. Only its eyes, those eyes, big and bright as saucers, looked at me. Those eyes weren't human eyes. They had no emotion, no life. It looked at me, unwavering, as if it wanted to see into my soul. A chill ran down my spine. Every gust of cold wind made me feel as if something invisible was following me. I slowed down, trying to stay calm, but it only made me more panicked. The creature stood firm, its eyes still on me, as if it knew I was trying to dodge. My steps felt like they were no longer in my control. I pressed the gas, but my legs felt like they were being held back. My truck crept past, inch by inch, and then it moved. One step, 2 steps, the creature began to move. Although there was no sound, I could feel its every movement as a strong blow to the still space. I saw its long, thin arms, reaching down almost to its knees. Each step seemed to plunge the space into deathly silence. A suffocating feeling enveloped me. I didn't dare look towards it, but I couldn't help but feel its presence, as if it was entering my mind, little by little. Suddenly, an oval head turned, looking straight at me through the truck window. It tilted its head, its huge eyes never leaving me. Its eyes were like 2 bottomless black holes. They looked into me, scrutinizing me, as if it knew everything I couldn't say. As I was almost past the creature, it suddenly took a step toward me, almost impossibly. Its enormous face was less than 2 feet from my side window. I froze, unable to move. From its gaze, I felt as if I were being watched, being explored. I stepped on the gas harder, rushing past it, but those eyes still haunted me. I didn't dare look back, but in the rearview mirror, I saw it standing there, not moving. It stood silently in the darkness, watching my truck, then gradually disappeared into the dense shadows beside the road. The truck's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but I no longer felt safe. The feeling of being watched still lingered, heavy as a ghost. I wanted to leave this road as quickly as possible, but I felt like the shadow was still following me, unable to escape. When I got to the police checkpoint, I could do nothing but stand there, eyes wide open, unable to say a word. The policeman looked at me suspiciously, not knowing what I was seeing. I wanted to explain, but I couldn't. What I had witnessed was not something that could be explained with words. The eyes of the policeman changed. They looked at each other and then back at me, but no one dared to say anything. They just kept silent, and that silence was more terrifying than anything. Near midnight, Lucas, a young man with sunken eyes and tired eyes, entered an old hotel on the edge of a deserted road in the French countryside. A steady rain beat down on the eaves. The wind whistled through the bare trees. In the inky sky, the neon sign, Chambers Disposables, flickered, casting an eerie red and green light on the wet road. The reception desk sat quietly in the right corner of the lobby, lit only by a single dim ceiling light. An elderly woman with disheveled white hair sat silently behind the desk. She did not greet him, but coldly pushed the key to room number 12 towards Lucas without even looking at him. Lucas took his keys and trudged up the old wooden stairs to his room on the 2nd floor. Each step he took made a creaking sound like the rotten wood groaning. Room 12 appeared with a faded painted door and rusted handle. Lucas stepped inside, feeling the strong smell of mold assault his sense of smell. The small room was sparsely furnished, an old bed with untidy sheets, an old wooden table, and a rickety nightlight in the corner. The walls were covered with patchy wallpaper, peeling patches revealing green moldy plaster underneath. What caught Lucas's attention was the window in the far corner of the room. A sign was stuck inside the glass frame, in bold French letters, Northeast pièce of rear, do not open. Stranger still, the window frame was nailed shut, with rusty nails driven into the wood, as if someone had deliberately sealed it from the outside. Lucas sighed and threw his suitcase on the floor. Even though the air conditioning was running, the air in the room was thick and stuffy, like a glass cage. He walked to the window and tried to turn the handle to open it, but the door wouldn't budge, as if it was stuck. Frustrated, Lucas pulled a screwdriver from his jacket pocket and began to pry open the door frame. The nails creaked, as if protesting against his strong force. Finally, the window swung open, revealing the heavy rain outside. A cold wind blew into the room, bringing with it dampness. Lucas breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a little better. But then he realized something was wrong. Outside the window frame, rusty nails were still intact, nailed tightly from the outside. This didn't make sense. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine, but he reassured himself that perhaps this was just the old hotel's way of keeping out strong winds. The next morning, Lucas went down to the front desk to check out. While accepting a sandwich from the old woman, he casually mentioned the window in his room, with a hint of annoyance in his voice. He told her about how it was boarded up, the strange nails, and the "do not open" sign. The woman's face paled at this. She gripped the pen on the reception desk, her hands shaking. After a few seconds of eerie silence, she looked up at Lucas, her eyes filled with worry. "Did you open that window?" Her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. Lucas nodded, a feeling of unease starting to rise in his heart. Her next words were like a knife to his mind. She told him that a few months ago, a man had rented room number 12. He was found jumping out the window and died shortly after. Since that day, the guests in that room began to hear strange whispers, invisible footsteps, and the feeling of being touched in the night. The nails in the door frame were not to keep out the storm. They were to keep him from calling anyone else. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine as he heard this. Without waiting another second, he rushed back to his room, trying to pack his things and leave the hotel immediately. But as he passed the window, a strange feeling made him stop. In the reflection of the glass, a figure stood right behind him. It was a man with a pale face, eyes as red as fire. His mouth was wide open, revealing sharp, deep-rooted teeth. His twisted, veined hands gripped Lucas's shoulders. Before he could turn around, the lights in the room flickered violently and then went out. In the suffocating darkness, a hoarse, cold voice rang out, as if coming from the depths of hell. "You shouldn't have opened that window." This is the third, or perhaps fourth, time I have attempted to write these words. Time seems to have lost its meaning. The days have passed into one another, each hour and each minute turning into a ceaseless stream of confusion and uncertainty. My husband, William, has been missing for 16 days. The London police don't take it seriously, but they don't understand. William is not the type to disappear without a trace. He was so immersed in his career, building a small financial empire, that I sometimes wonder if he even remembers having a family. But now, all that remains are unanswered questions. I was sitting in his office, where everything smelled of William. The desk was covered with papers, numbers carefully jotted down on each page, each line. The room was small but intimate, located on the second floor of an old house on the outskirts of London. A cold wind blew through the window, making the old curtains flutter, but I didn't close them. The fresh air was the only thing that kept me calm. But this did not dispel the feeling that something was wrong. Over the past few days, things in the office began to change. The papers on my desk that I had tried to keep tidy seemed to move by themselves. I heard strange noises at night, whispers and slight rustling, as if someone was fumbling through the papers. At first, I thought it was just the wind or mice, but then inexplicable things began to happen. William's favorite leather chair was the center of it all. At first, I noticed it was slightly out of place, as if someone had sat on it and pulled it out. I pushed it back, but every morning it was facing the door, even though I was sure I'd adjusted it before bed. A dark stain began to appear on the armrests. I tried scrubbing it off, but it wouldn't go away, and it seemed to get darker every day. Every night, the sounds in the room grew clearer. First a rustle, then a light scratching from the wooden floor. The source of the sound was always under William's chair. I had taken out the floorboards a few weeks ago for repairs, and I knew there was nothing there. But now I wasn't so sure. I haven't slept in 3 days. Last night, I woke from a fitful dream to find my desk covered in sheets of paper. Numbers were scribbled in a handwriting that looked like mine, but I had no memory of writing them. The notes listed account numbers, passwords, and transfers made at different times of the night, enough so as not to set off the bank's alarm system. My fingers were covered in ink, but I had no memory of touching a pen. My hands shook as I went through the documents. They were more than numbers. They were clues, vague pieces of a story I didn't understand. William had always told me to stay away from his finances. He had made that clear the night before he disappeared. Suddenly, a loud scratching sound came from under the floorboards. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. A familiar, pungent smell rose up. William's cologne, but mixed with something else, a sickly, fishy smell. I heard footsteps in the hallway. The lights in the room flickered, as if they were about to fail. I turned to look at the leather chair. It was turned all the way to me, as if inviting me. The cracks in the chair formed strange patterns, almost like symbols. I tried to ignore them and backed toward the door, but as my hand touched the knob, there was a knock. The knocking wasn't coming from the door, but from the floor. The next morning, the police came. They asked about the fresh soil in the backyard. I pointed to the flower beds I had tended after William disappeared. They didn't suspect anything, but I knew they were looking in the wrong place. The floorboards in the office, that was where they should have been looking. They never asked the right questions, and I had no intention of telling them. What was happening was inexplicable, and they never would. William was still there. I felt him in every dark corner, every soft, terrifying sound. I'm just not sure if you want me to help you, or if you want me to replace you. As a child, I always looked to the light to feel safe. In the small bedroom on the second floor of the old house, the lamp in the closet was my faithful companion. Its bright white light dispelled the dense darkness and the ghostly illusions that my young imagination created. Every night, after reading my favorite books, I often forgot to turn off the light, leaving it on until the next morning. But then one night, that light went out. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the room was plunged into darkness. The only light was the faint moonlight outside the window, casting strange shadows on the walls. I could feel my heart beating faster, as if a small storm was raging in my chest. I didn't dare move, my eyes glued to the closet door where the light had been. I told myself it was just a broken bulb. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. A faint sound came from the closet door. It was soft, like the soft dragging of fabric across a wooden floor. I don't remember how I fell asleep that night, but anxiety haunted me in my broken dreams. A few months later, my family moved to a larger house on the outskirts of London. It was a 2-story house with large rooms, long hallways, and old wooden floors that creaked when you walked on them. My parents worked late, so I often came home alone after school. The house was dark and quiet in the early afternoon. One day, as I walked through the front door, I called out, "Mom." The sound echoed through the empty hallways. Before I could climb the stairs, I heard a reply from the second floor. "What?" It was my mother's voice, but there was something different about the tone. It was not the warmth I was used to, but cold and empty. I called out to her again as I climbed the stairs, and again she said, "What?" The voice came from the end of a long hallway, from a closed room. All the rooms on this floor were still in the process of being decorated, the furniture in disarray, the tarps covering the furniture making strange shapes in the dim light. My steps faltered as I approached the door. Each step on the wooden floor made a low groan, as if the house were groaning. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. But then another sound came from downstairs. The front door opened and my mother called, "Honey, are you home?" Her voice was warm and cheerful, as it always was. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and ran down the stairs. When I reached the bottom step, I glanced back up. The door I had intended to open slowly creaked, silently, revealing a narrow, dark opening. And in that brief moment, I saw it. Something stood inside, in the deep darkness of the room. Its eyes glowed faintly, like two small flames obscured by a thick mist. Its shape was tall and slender. It was unclear if it was human or something else. But it was staring at me, unblinking. I rushed to my mother, feeling my own breathing labored. She held me close, but I dared not speak of what I had seen. Part of me wasn't sure it had really happened. But another part, deep down, knew it wasn't my imagination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt like those eyes were still watching me from some dark corner of the house, where the light never reached. But the darkness did not let me go. The first noise came from downstairs. It wasn't a loud noise, just a small click, like someone was testing the doorknob. I told myself it was just the normal noise of an old house. But then the click came again, louder and clearer this time. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat up, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence of the room. The bedside lamp beside me flickered faintly before going out, leaving me in complete darkness. My breathing became ragged, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door as if it might swing open at any moment. Then I heard footsteps. It was not hurried, but slow, step by step, from the stairs leading to the second floor. The footsteps were not my mother's or my father's. They were heavy and dragged across the wooden floor, making a creaking sound and a slight scratching sound like claws touching the surface. I didn't dare move. My eyes were glued to the crack between the door and the floor. A faint light from the hallway outside filtered in through the crack, but when I looked closely, it seemed to be obscured by a shadow. The shadow stopped right in front of my room door. I held my breath, not wanting to make any noise. But the door, as if moved by an invisible force, slowly opened. I wanted to scream, but my throat was choked. Before me, thick darkness seemed to pour into the room, and in that moment I saw eyes. They glowed faintly, still two small, faint flames, but this time they moved closer, as if scanning the room for me. I could feel its presence, cold, heavy, and completely out of this world. Then it moved. Its tall, misshapen form swept across the room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It stood beside my bed, its glowing eyes staring down at me. A low murmur came from somewhere, the sound like wind coming through a crack in the door, but with a voice that was not human. "Remember me?" I couldn't respond. I don't know what I did to wake it, but it clearly knew me. Its cold breath fanned down, and I felt like my heart was being squeezed. In a panic, I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, turned it on, and shined it directly into the eyes. The light made it recoil, the shadow twisting as if burned by the weak light. It backed away towards the door, its eyes never leaving me, until it disappeared completely. The door to my room closed with a loud click. I sat there, shivering, the flashlight illuminating every corner of the room. I couldn't sleep anymore. My eyes didn't dare leave the door, afraid that the shadow would return. The next morning, I told my mother everything. She looked at me with worried eyes, but said nothing. In the afternoon, I noticed her quietly walking up to the second floor with a small candle in her hand. She went into the room at the end of the hallway, the room where I had seen that shadow. I heard her mumble something, like a prayer. When she walked away, her eyes were blank, as if she had seen something she did not want to recall. That night, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, it didn't stop in front of my door. It continued down the hallway, as if searching for something or someone. And I know, it won't stop until it finds what it wants. Little did I know that my decision to move to the countryside would lead me into a nightmare. My new home, once a place where I hoped to find peace after months of being haunted by a stalker, would now become the center of my greatest fear. At first, I loved the house. The walls were covered in vintage wallpaper, the ceilings were high and airy, and the large windows looked out onto the green fields. Everything felt warm and cozy. Amelia, my kind neighbor, would often stop by to check on me, bringing me delicious apple pies and invitations to dinner with her family. It all made for a perfect picture, but something was wrong from the start. After a few days, I began to feel a presence. That feeling, as if someone was standing right behind me, just a breath away. I tried to convince myself that this was just a remnant of my old obsession, but that didn't ease the anxiety that was building up every day. I couldn't sleep. The first few nights, I lay listening to the creaking of the old house, the wind through the cracks in the door, and the soft sounds that I told myself were natural. But then the noises became more unusual, a tapping on the wall, a rustling on the ceiling, and footsteps that seemed to have no destination. After a week, I left the house. I went to Amelia's house to stay, and it was there that I heard the story of the murderer who had lived in my house. The story made my skin crawl, but at the same time, it also explained the haunting I was experiencing. Amelia said the murderer was caught in that house. He was found with the body of a young girl, her eyes wide open, staring straight at him the whole time. I didn't want to hear more, but Amelia continued. Legend said he was never comfortable without the feeling that someone was watching him, and it seemed like it had become part of the house. When I returned, things seemed to get worse. The feeling of being watched was more than just a feeling. I began to hear whispers, soft noises from behind the walls, from above. Every time I walked down the hallway, I could feel invisible eyes on me, cold and piercing. The tipping point came that morning. I was standing in the kitchen, trying to make breakfast, when the feeling of being watched became unbearable. It was no longer a premonition. I could feel the gaze, sharp and penetrating, as if someone were standing right behind me. In a panic, I threw the kitchen knife without thinking. The cold thud of it hitting the wall rang out. As I moved closer to pull the knife out, I noticed there was a small gap where the blade had been inserted. The dim light from the kitchen filtered through the gap, and I saw it. A pair of eyes. They were soaked in a clear liquid, as if looking right through me, dead yet alive. I called the police immediately. In less than an hour, they were there and began a thorough search of the house. I sat on the front steps, shaking and trying to calm my racing heart. Footsteps, the sound of hammering, and short commands echoed from inside. The police began peeling back the walls, the wood paneling. Small glass jars were stacked on top of each other, containing pairs of eyes carefully preserved in formaldehyde. The eyes were not those of a mannequin or a doll, but of a human. They were still wide open, haunting, as if watching my every move. 142 pairs of eyes. I counted with them. Jars were taken from every corner of the house, walls, floors, even inside an old armchair in the living room. The police took me outside, advising me to leave immediately. But I couldn't take my eyes off those jars. They were all looking at me, their gazes dark as if conveying something. As night fell, I realized I couldn't stay in this house. I packed, but as I packed, I heard it. A whisper, indistinct but haunting. It came from behind the wall where the eyes had been. "I'm looking at you." I froze. When I turned around, the walls were flat, but I could feel something moving inside. I left the house that night, and when I looked back one last time, I saw a dim light in the second-floor window, as if someone was standing there, watching me. I used to live in a small, sleepy town in the north of Scotland, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. It was a small, unassuming town, a mere blip on the map, where people lived simply and big events rarely occurred. But beneath the surface of its peacefulness lay a mysterious mist, an inexplicable sense of suffocation. I don't remember why I decided to take that road that night. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was my own stupidity. It was late at night, and the deserted road was not exactly the kind of place anyone in their right mind would choose to walk. But I wasn't. The alcohol had dulled my mind, and my feet stumbled on the damp ground, making a squelching sound in the silence. The cold night wind blew through, blowing the thin coat I was wearing. I pulled it close to my body, but it couldn't stop the cold from penetrating my bones. The pale moonlight shone down on the muddy road, creating shadows that seemed to want to swallow me. All around, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the bare branches, like a lonely harmony. In my drunken stupor, I tried to sing a few lines to dispel the fear that surrounded me. But my distorted voice sounded less like a song and more like the mumbles of someone lost in the dark. The song echoed back, mingled with the wind, and then disappeared into the thick fog ahead. My legs were unsteady. Each step felt like I was about to collapse on the muddy ground. But I kept walking, my mind only thinking about getting home, where the warm light and soft bed awaited me. I told myself that if I could just get through this stretch of road, everything would be fine. Then I saw the girl. The girl squatted by the side of the road, her small figure barely visible in the thick fog. I stopped, my legs no longer steady from the alcohol. My breath caught in my throat, not from the cold, but from the strangeness of the scene before me. The girl bowed her head, her long, tangled hair falling down to cover her face, her skinny hands digging into the dirt slowly. Each movement was steady and precise, as if she were performing an important task. I frowned, trying to focus on the image before me, but the alcohol made everything blurry. I mumbled something I couldn't quite make out, maybe a greeting or a silly question. But the girl didn't look up, still staring at the pile of dirt in front of her. My steps faltered as I got closer. When I was only a few steps away from her, she suddenly raised her head. Her eyes made me shiver. They were pitch black, without any whites, like two bottomless pits sucking in the light and my breath. The little girl's pale face was revealed under the dim moonlight, her pale skin stretched as thin as paper. Her small lips curved strangely, forming a smile that I couldn't tell if it was innocent or malicious. "You're digging your father's grave," her voice said, soft but cold enough to freeze me. "He caused your mother to miscarry. He abandoned us. Now he's dead." I took a step back, a chill spreading through my body. I wanted to ask something, but my throat felt constricted. The little girl's words, her hollow tone, and those pitch-black eyes made it impossible for me to think clearly. "I don't care about your family business," I muttered in confusion and fear, trying to turn away and leave this bizarre scene. But as I turned, my foot caught on a dry branch lying in the middle of the road. Before I knew it, I was falling forward. I felt the wet, muddy soil stick to my hands and clothes, but the worst was yet to come. My head slammed into a large rock on the side of the road. A dry sound rang out in the air, accompanied by a sharp pain that made my head spin. Blood poured out of the wound, seeping into the cold ground. I tried to move, but my limbs no longer obeyed my will. My breathing became heavy, my vision blurred as the blood flowed in streams. In the moment between life and death, I heard soft footsteps. The girl approached, her deep black eyes still fixed on me. Her face no longer smiled, but there was something strange in her gaze, satisfaction, or perhaps a sick joy. She bent down close to me, her small hands picking up a handful of dirt. I wanted to say something, to beg the little girl to help me, but I couldn't. Everything was slowly fading into darkness, but before the last light disappeared, I heard her voice again, as light as a breath of wind. Finally done. I don't know what happened next. I only felt the cold mud covering my body, layer by layer, like an invisible hand digging a deeper grave for me. The wind continued to blow, carrying a screeching laugh among the trees, as if it were mocking me, the unfortunate prey of the night. She stepped back, leaving me in the darkness of the thick fog. I didn't know if she was human or something else, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer the only one buried on this road. Darkness seemed to swallow me up. The pain from the impact blurred my consciousness, leaving only the coldness of the mud gradually enveloping me. Amidst the thick fog and the wind whistling through the trees, a faint light suddenly appeared. It did not belong to the moon or any other natural light source, but a fragile, flickering ray of hope in a nightmare. Footsteps echoed, urgent and decisive, in stark contrast to the deathly silence that surrounded me. A figure approached, a flashlight in his hand sweeping through the mist, illuminating the area where I lay. Through the flickering light, I caught a glimpse of a worried face, eyes staring at me with tension. This man, with a simple yet determined appearance, bent down beside me, his hands quickly examining the wound on my head. The sting of his hand brought me back to consciousness. The hazy feeling gradually disappeared, replaced by a clear awareness of this stranger. He was trying to stop the bleeding from my wound, his hand shaking but steady, as if trying to pull me away from the jaws of death. The flickering flashlight beam swept across the street, and I caught a glimpse of the girl's figure. She stood still, not moving closer, but her dark eyes continued to follow me. Her gaze was no longer curious or indifferent, but contained a deep, cold warning that was chilling. Her face was pale in the dim light, no smile, only a haunting emptiness. The man didn't stop for long. After giving me a temporary bandage, he pulled me up, the strength of his small body surprising me. Even though my limbs were shaking, he still helped me walk through the muddy path, the light from his flashlight guiding me through the dense darkness. Each step was difficult, but each step carried with it the hope that I would escape this darkness. When I turned my head to look back one last time, the little girl's figure was still there. She stood motionless in the mist, like a ghost that did not belong to this world. Her deep black eyes seemed to still be fixed on me, like a mark that would never fade. I don't know why that man showed up, or what brought him there at the right time, but his presence saved me, pulled me back from the depths of death. Yet, I still couldn't shake the haunting image of the little girl in her eyes, a reminder that I could never truly escape this darkness. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. Stories of strange creatures and haunted houses were things I had read about in books and movies and paid no attention to. But then I moved into this house, and everything changed. It was an old house, with peeling bricks and a loose roof, sitting alone at the end of a dead-end street. It was incredibly cheap, and though people around me hinted at its past, I didn't care. I couldn't afford to be picky. This was the only thing I could afford, and I was fine with it. The first night, I thought it was all my imagination. The floorboards creaked above my head as I tried to sleep. I told myself it was the old house groaning in its disrepair. I paid no attention, trying to close my eyes and sleep. But the second night, things were different. I was sitting in front of the TV, the flickering light illuminating the dark room, my eyes slowly growing heavy. I was about to fall asleep when a soft sound rang out, the sound of slow footsteps on the wooden floor upstairs. It was not the harmless groan of an old house. It carried a steady rhythm. Each step seemed to deliberately attract my attention. My heart was pounding, my breathing was heavy. I gathered all my courage and walked up the stairs. Each step made a small creak that made me want to turn and run. I turned on the hallway light upstairs, the weak yellow light illuminating the long, narrow space. At first, I couldn't see anything, just a long hallway with closed doors. Then I saw it. From down the hall, something began to appear. First an arm, long and skinny, skin stretched tight over thin bones, as if the skin were trying to hold together a shape that was out of place. Then another arm, and another. It crawled out of the darkness, hunched and twisted, as if the body had never been made for this world. Its body was long as a snake, but rugged and twisted like a living nightmare. Its wide mouth stretched from temple to temple, and there were no eyes, just a terrifying emptiness. It emitted a low, drawn-out groan that made every nerve in my body tense. I couldn't take my eyes off it, but when it began to move toward me, each movement slow but determined, I turned and ran. I don't know how I got downstairs. I locked the door and called the police, mumbling a lie about a burglar in the house. 2 officers arrived shortly afterward, their faces stern and impassive as I pointed upstairs. They stepped forward, their flashlights glaring through the darkness, and that was the last I saw of them. I heard no screams, no sounds of a struggle. There was only an eerie silence. After a few minutes, I called their names, but there was no answer. I knew they would never return. The next few days, I lived in fear. The footsteps, the moaning noises continued every night, as if the creature was reminding me that it was still there. I knew I couldn't go on like this. But when I called the landlord to check, he never came back. Eventually, I had to accept the fact that I was living with something that did not belong to this world. I called it the friend upstairs, ironically to ease my fear. Still, the haunting haunted me every day, especially when my brother came to visit. I warned him not to go upstairs, but he didn't listen. I still remember his voice screaming from upstairs, the sound filled with panic and pain. I didn't run to save him. I knew there was nothing else to do. That was the last time I heard his voice. I now live in a small room downstairs, imprisoned by fear and the groaning footsteps from above. I don't know what it is, where it came from, or what it wants. But it's there, in the dark, waiting. And I don't know how much longer I can take it. In 1994, I was a curious Year 7 student, spending holidays with my cousins in the bush near Davenport, Northern Territory. Those were the days I cherished most, when we ran wild across the vast plains, playing traditional games like Barambagim and Chubu Chubu. Every day was carefree and joyful. That day was no different. One sunny afternoon, we found a large set of footprints near the trees at the end of the yard. My cousin Carlos was the first to notice them. The prints were unusual, larger and longer than any we had ever seen. We figured they might have been emu tracks or some stray ostrich from the nearby farm. Being children, curiosity was quickly overcome by the joy of play, and we thought no more about them. As the afternoon wore on, my uncle called us in for dinner. The meal was simple but cozy, with sandwiches and hot stew. Afterwards, we played a little more in the light of the large spotlight in front of the house. In that warm yellow light, it seemed that nothing could disturb our safety. But that safety did not last long. As the night grew late and the wind grew colder, we retreated to our shared bedroom upstairs. It was a large room with bunk beds, where evenings were often filled with laughter and long sessions of Super Nintendo. But that night, the loud barking of a dog outside shattered the peace. The barking was fierce and panicked, as if they were facing something they could not fight. Mixed with the dog's barking, a strange howl echoed in the distance, a long, sharp sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart sank, but I did not let fear control me. I rushed down the stairs, ran outside to pull the dogs into the house. When I got there, I found them huddled in a corner, eyes wide and staring into the darkness. I grabbed their leashes and pulled them into the house. No matter how I tried to soothe them, the dogs shivered, huddled against my legs and my siblings, as if they were protecting us from something terrifying. As I went back upstairs, I heard my uncle and aunt whispering in the next room. Their soft words were laced with tension. A sense of unease filled me as the doorknob to our room slowly turned, and the door opened. My uncle entered, his face serious, and pulled me close. He said we were not to go out again, and ordered us all into the large bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was dimly lit with a large window facing the front yard. We gathered around the window, where my uncle and aunt stood, staring into the darkness. I asked what was going on, and my other uncle whispered a name in my ear that made me freeze: Kurdacha. The Kurdacha, in our lore, is a sorcerer or executioner. He is described as a skinwalker in other cultures, a dangerous creature that wields dark magic. Old stories say he moves silently with emu feathers stuck to his feet, which help him hide his tracks and hunt his prey. We couldn't see anything in the dark out there, so my cousin Carlos was sent down to turn on the headlights. The headlights swept across the yard, and then we saw it. Standing in the middle of the yard was a dingo, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was enormous, taller than a grown man, standing on its hind legs. Its body was long and lean, with large feathers clinging to its legs, covered in dark dried blood. Its eyes glowed in the headlights, never leaving our window. Fear gripped me when I saw that thing. But the most terrifying thing was the long, sharp bone in its hand. My uncle immediately pulled the curtain back and told us to lie down on the ground. He said that if Kredacha pointed the bone at anyone, that person would never escape death, sooner or later. We lay still on the floor, listening to the sounds outside. Footsteps echoed slowly, each step heavy as if searching for a target. We didn't dare to breathe loudly, afraid that any noise would alert the thing to our presence. When things quieted down, I remembered the strange footprints we had seen during the day. He must have been there all along, silently watching us, biding his time. When I went out to get the dogs, he must have been close by, maybe just a few feet away. Even now, whenever I think about it, I shudder. I cannot forget those glowing red eyes, or the tall, misshapen figure standing motionless in the middle of the yard. This remote area was a place of mysteries we would never fully understand, and some of them never learned to distinguish friend from foe. Smeaton, a small, peaceful town in regional Victoria, Australia, was where I chose to start my new life. I was drawn to the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being away from the noisy world outside. My house was located on the edge of a small valley, with a winding stream running through it. When I first moved in, I felt it was ideal. Everything was perfect for me to enjoy life in a relaxed way. However, that peace did not last long. A week after moving in, I noticed something strange as I looked out my window. A small path had appeared out of nowhere, running straight up the valley and ending just outside my fence. I was sure it had never been there before, but I didn't think much of it, thinking that perhaps the wildlife around here had made it. But a few days later, things started to get weirder. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard a rustling noise outside my window, right where the trail led. I wasn't sure what was going on, but something told me it wasn't normal. I looked outside, and in the dim moonlight, I saw a figure running down the slope. It was moving so fast that I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it was moving unnaturally. I felt something was wrong, so I decided to write down everything that happened. The diary became my companion, recording details that I couldn't explain. Diary, the first days. November 3rd. The footsteps came again tonight, this time more clearly. The noise was coming from the direction of the trail. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it felt like someone was walking near the fence. Could it be the vandals? I know some drug addicts who live across the creek. Maybe they were spying on my house? November 12th. This time, the fence was cut. A loud noise woke me up around 11 p.m. When I turned on my outdoor light, I saw a section of the fence had been cut cleanly, as if someone had used bolt cutters. This was clearly no accident. It felt like a veiled threat. I feared for my safety. November 15th. The entire side fence was flattened this morning. The cutting marks were sharp, not like a regular tool. I reported it to the local police, but I'm not sure what they can do. From this point on, unease began to creep into my every thought. These events, while strange, had a practical explanation. I reassured myself that they were probably human acts, a group of vandals or drug addicts looking for something to steal. But the anxiety persisted, especially when I couldn't explain the source of the noises at night. When the light of day falls, everything seems normal again. But every night, my house, and the space around it, becomes a different place. A place where every sense is strained to search for signs of something unseen. November 18th. I hear from the police that the drug addicts who live across the creek have been arrested for vandalism in the area. This should have reassured me, but somehow I still don't feel safe. Part of me tells me it's not over. November 23rd. Last night, I woke up to find that the window next door had been smashed. Glass was scattered all over the floor, large pieces of it scattered about. What was strange were the scratches around the window frame. They were deep, long, and irregular, not like they had been made by a regular tool. I called the police, but even they were baffled by the marks. December 1st. I woke up in the morning to find large footprints in the wet grass of my backyard. They were huge, each step longer than an adult human stride. There was fine hair around the edges, as if the creature had a thick coat of fur. I didn't know what to think. Security cameras were installed, and I was determined to find out what was really going on. December 5th. My last night in the house was beyond anything I could have imagined. After checking the security camera footage, all my doubts were erased. What I saw on the screen was inexplicable, unbelievable. At first, the shot showed a dark figure looming over the trees in the valley. It was not human, tall, gaunt, moving slowly, but no less terrifying. Then a long, spindly arm reached out from the trees, followed by an unnaturally tall torso. The creature dragged itself toward the house, its long legs moving awkwardly like a puppet on strings. From 11 p.m. to almost 4 a.m., it just stood there, right in the middle of the yard, occasionally turning its head to look towards the living room window. Sometimes it came closer, climbed the steps in front of the door, pressed its face against the glass as if searching for something. But it didn't come in. I don't know why. Maybe it couldn't, or maybe it was waiting. What was worse was that it wasn't alone. Around midnight, 2 more shadows stepped out of the trees, each one similarly twisted and grotesque. They joined the first silently, as if performing some sort of ritual. They all just stood there, staring at my house. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was frozen with unspeakable horror. I packed my things in chaos, trying not to make a sound. At dawn, as the sun was just rising, I left the house, not looking back once. I didn't want to know what would happen if I stayed another night. To this day, I still can't comprehend what I saw. Those creatures, those shadows, they weren't of this world. And I can't help but think that they're still there, among the trees of the valley, waiting for someone careless enough to enter their territory. I left that house behind forever. But the memory of that last night, of those eyes in the dark and the unexplainable presence, will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was a teenager then, full of enthusiasm and a passion for adventure. My brother and I spent our summers camping by the river at a place called Big Bend. It was a small, remote spot, but one of unrivaled beauty. We often set up camp near a large waterhole, where locals would gather during the day to jump off a rock wall into the water. My most memorable trip to Big Bend wasn't just me and my brother. This time, our half-brother and his girlfriend joined us. From the very beginning, the trip had a strange atmosphere that I couldn't explain. A vague feeling, as if something was watching us from afar. That evening, in the dim light of the campfire, my half-brother began to tell scary stories. He talked about strange creatures called quinken, mysterious spirits in Australian Aboriginal culture. According to the story, quinken were not simply mischievous ghosts but dangerous entities, lurking in the bush and attacking those unfortunate enough to encounter them. Although the story seemed scary, I did not feel scared at that moment. On the contrary, I felt curious. I have always been fascinated by mysteries and horrors, but that curiosity did not last long. Soon, we were faced with something that no story could have prepared us for. After the campfire died down, we decided to take a walk around the large pool near the campsite. Night had fallen, and darkness enveloped everything around us. As we rounded a corner, we saw a large pool of water reflecting the moonlight. In the distance, a huge stone wall rose up, casting a dark shadow on the water. As we were walking, my half-brother suddenly stopped. Without saying a word, he turned and ran in the opposite direction. This unusual action stunned my brother and I. Before we could understand what was happening, my eyes began to notice strange shapes on the stone wall. At first, they were just blurry silhouettes. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, the shapes became clearer. They looked like people, but not quite. The creatures crawled up the stone wall on their hands and feet, dragging themselves awkwardly, as if they were unfamiliar with their own bodies. When they reached the top, they did not stand upright but lay on their stomachs, their heads sticking out over the edge of the cliff. They all lay still, just hanging in the air, staring down at the pool of water below. The sight sent a chill down my spine. My brother yelled, trying to warn them not to jump. But instead of reacting, the creatures leaned further, their heads lowered, as if defying gravity. Then each one of them plunged into the water, their bodies making horrible noises as they hit the sharp rocks below. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. We looked down into the water, hoping to find some sign of life, but instead another horror awaited us. The creatures did not sink or disappear. Instead, they floated to the surface, one head at a time, their faces turned toward us. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths were open in a hideous smile. We stood there, motionless, frozen in horror at the unbelievable sight that was unfolding. Shadowy, dark creatures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths floated on the water, slowly moving towards us. The sound of splashing water echoed in rhythm, mixed with the gasps of my brother and I. They were not human, not like any creature I had ever known. Their movements were completely unnatural. Not swimming, but gliding, as if pulled by some invisible force. Every time their heads emerged from the water, the moonlight reflected on their distorted faces, adding to the terror. We just stood there, mesmerized by this terrifying presence. But as they neared the shore, as long, spindly limbs emerged from the water, I knew I had to do something. One of the creatures pulled its body out of the water, revealing thin arms, as if they were covered in thin, wrinkled skin. It climbed up the bank, its long nails scraping the wet sand, making a sickening metallic sound. My brother screamed, pulling me into a run for his life toward the bushes. The creatures wouldn't let us off the hook. They continued to crawl up the bank, following us with jerky movements that were surprisingly fast. As I turned, I saw a creature almost touching my brother. Its mouth opened wider, revealing needle-sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. It made a strange sound, not a hiss, not a roar, but something like a whisper that twisted in the air. We plunged into the bush, leaving the riverbank behind. Strangely, as we reached the edge of the trees, the creatures stopped abruptly. They just stood there, bobbing in the sand, as if there was an invisible line they could not cross. But their empty eyes never left us, as if watching, waiting for another opportunity. Without wasting time to think, we ran straight back to camp, hearts pounding, cold sweat soaking our shirts. My half-brother was there, his face pale with worry. We just shouted that we had to leave immediately. No one asked questions, no one argued. We packed up in silence and left the place, leaving Big Bend and the eerie darkness behind. That was the last time I went to Big Bend. I will never forget the hollow eyes and gaping mouths of those creatures, nor the feeling of being hunted in the darkness. Sometimes, in my dreams, I see myself standing by the water, and those dark figures drifting toward me. I'm not sure what those creatures were. Maybe they were Quincan, like my half-brother told me. Or maybe they were something even more ancient and terrifying. But one thing I know for sure, they were not of this world, and I hope I never have to face them again. When we were teenagers living in Home Hill, life was peaceful and simple. My little house was located just off the Budekin River, which separated our town from the more prosperous air. The wide, violent river was renowned not only for its wild beauty, but also for its notorious predator, the saltwater crocodile. They were prehistoric beasts, silent killers beneath the murky surface. My best friend Gavin and I had been waiting for years to take our first real camping trip. We'd heard enough warnings about the dangers of the area. Don't swim, don't leave any leftovers, and stay away from the water's edge. But at 15, we felt strong and invulnerable. One morning in mid-July, we packed up and headed to a secluded riverbank we had been eyeing for a while. A spot surrounded by ancient gum trees and soft white sand. The spot was like a little paradise, perfect for pitching a tent and building a campfire. All went well for the afternoon. We roasted marshmallows, drank soda, and told jokes in the soft sunlight. But as the evening wore on, the mood began to change. The biting cold of the Australian winter crept into every corner of the tent. We decided to retreat inside, pull up our blankets, and continue telling each other spooky stories. As I was telling a story, the first sound came from outside. At first it was faint, like the wind in the trees. But then it became clearer, a heavy, slow, ominous dragging sound. Gavin stopped mid-story, his eyes flashing with concern. We both knew that sound. An alligator was dragging its massive body up the bank, toward the campsite. In the dim light, I could see its cold eyes, watching, waiting for us to slip up. We quickly turned off our flashlights and crouched behind the tent, holding our breaths. The shuffling grew closer, mingling with a heavy wheezing sound. I heard Gavin fumble for his pocket knife, a risky idea, but the only option if things got out of hand. Then, it stopped right in front of the tent. I could feel its presence, heavy, cold, and threatening. It sniffed the air, as if it were sniffing. I didn't dare move. I felt like my heart would stop beating at any moment. We waited, hoping it would leave. But instead, a new sound appeared. A different sound, not the crocodile's. The dragging sound seemed to change, becoming different, longer and slower, as if the crocodile were being dragged away. Gavin glanced at me, his eyes filled with horror. We heard footsteps, heavy and powerful, coming closer. There was a terrible sound of flesh tearing, tendons being severed, and organs falling to the ground. I couldn't imagine what could have done this. We both tried not to breathe, not to move, just to listen in horror. The sound went on and on, as if the creature was deliberately prolonging the crocodile's suffering. Then everything went silent. No more roaring, no more dragging. Just deathly silence. The strange noise still echoed in my head, even after the silence outside. Gavin held my hand tightly, and we said nothing, just staring at each other in the dim light of the tent. It felt like we were being held captive by an invisible predator. Suddenly, the heavy sound of footsteps rang out again. Not like the shuffling of a crocodile, but a steady, and terribly heavy step. I slowly reached for the zipper and pulled it open just enough to peek out. The moonlight shone down on the sand, illuminating the scene before me. And that was when I saw it. A towering figure loomed over the space, right next to the crocodile's body. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, its body as massive as a living rock. Its limbs were gaunt, but it exuded a sense of power. Its skin was unlike anything I had ever seen, dark gray, cracked like dry earth, and in places oozing a viscous liquid. Its head was misshapen, as if twisted by some invisible force. What sent the chills down my spine the most were its eyes, deep sockets glowing a pale red. They scanned the campsite, as if searching for something. They stopped, staring at our tent. I didn't dare move. Gavin froze too, his hand shaking as it gripped mine. The creature lifted an arm. Long, claw-like fingers stretched forward. It made a gesture that was as inviting as anything I'd ever seen. I heard a heavy, rasping breath coming from it. The air around me suddenly felt strangely cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the area. The creature slowly walked towards us, each step making the ground tremble slightly. Gavin tried to stay calm, whispering in my ear, "We have to run." But I knew running wasn't a better solution either. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It raised its head, as if it had smelled something in the air. A howl echoed in the distance, long and low. The creature turned its head immediately, looking toward the opposite bank of the river. It stood there for a moment, as if listening. Then, without warning, it turned and walked slowly away. Its large silhouette disappeared behind the trees, leaving behind a heavy silence. Gavin and I remained still, not daring to move, until we were sure the creature had gone. As the first light of dawn broke, we hastily packed up, not bothering to eat or rest. We just wanted to get out of there, as quickly as possible. That was the last time I was near the Budekin River. Gavin and I never spoke of that night again, but I knew that the image of that creature would haunt us forever. I didn't know what it was, a Malangi, a Quincan, or some other entity from the Dreamtime stories. But I knew that it was no friend to humans, and it certainly didn't belong in our world. When I close my eyes every night, I can still see those glowing red eyes, silently watching from the darkness. And I wonder, will it come back to find me one day? Brisbane in December is a strangely beautiful place. The city comes alive with festive lights, wreaths draped across the street corners, and the sound of Christmas carols blaring from the shops. But at night, as the crowds fade and the streetlights become lost in the darkness, the city takes on a different, darker, more mysterious appearance. I never thought I would be afraid of Brisbane. I grew up here. I knew every street, every corner by heart. But that night, the familiar sense of security was replaced by an indescribable anxiety, an invisible presence that seemed to follow me, every step, every breath. It all started when I got a call from my cousin Paula. She wanted me to buy some gifts for her new boyfriend's kids, a seemingly simple request that ended up dragging me into a nightmare with no way out. I left the hotel around 9 p.m. The streets were strangely deserted. Instead of the usual bustle of people, there were only a few faint, silent figures moving back and forth. A cold wind blew, carrying the musty smell of the Brisbane River. I pulled my coat closer to me and quickened my pace towards Queen Street Mall. As I approached the shopping district, I noticed a group of children running across the street, their laughter echoing through the quiet. They were followed by a tall man dressed like a street performer, walking on tall stilts. His long legs made a haunting, rhythmic clatter on the cobblestones. I told myself he was probably just a latecomer, but there was something about him that I couldn't take my eyes off. The lights from the shops on both sides of the street gradually dimmed, giving way to darkness. The Christmas music also faded away, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the doors. A feeling of unease crept up inside me, as if the city was slowly disappearing, little by little, pulling me into another space, a space that did not belong to humans. As I entered the mall, I noticed an eerie silence. Stores began rolling down their shutters, the creaking echoing down the long hallways. I quickly made my way to Target, hoping to grab a few gifts and leave before everything closed. Things started to get weird when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just another shopper, but when I turned around, I saw no one. The footsteps continued, steady, following me every step of the way. I felt goosebumps rise on my skin, as if an invisible pair of eyes were watching my every move. When I arrived at Target, I breathed a sigh of relief to see the bright lights inside. But that sense of security didn't last long. As I walked through the aisles, picking out toys and books, I realized I was completely alone. No employees, no other customers. Just me and the eerie silence, broken only occasionally by Christmas music blasting from overhead speakers. The sound distorted, as if played backwards. As I walked to the checkout counter, the overhead lights suddenly went out, one by one, leaving me in darkness. My heart pounded as strange sounds echoed in the distance, a clattering sound, like stilt-walking footsteps, but heavier and dragging. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the empty hallways. I didn't dare turn around, trying to finish scanning my purchases and leave quickly. Walking out of Target, I noticed that the mall was now completely silent. The dim neon lights flickered on the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I walked quickly toward the exit, but felt like something was following me. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I continued, the footsteps echoed. As I approached the exit, I saw a stilt walker standing in the middle of the road. He was tall, his long legs bent unnaturally. His face was hidden in the darkness, but his red eyes glowed, looking straight at me. I felt my breath catch, my body stiffen as if frozen. Footsteps echoed behind me, and I realized I was no longer alone. Other tall figures emerging from the dark corners of the mall. Tall figures, shuffling their feet, haunting. I turned and ran, but it felt like I was running in a nightmare. Each step heavy, unable to move fast enough to escape them. I ran as fast as I could through the dark corridors of the mall. The shuffling footsteps behind me kept ringing, like invisible hammers pounding on my eardrums. Those people, tall figures, moved slowly but purposefully. The clatter of their stilts echoed in the empty space, but strangely, each step sounded like something heavy was dragging across the floor. As I turned a corner, my heart almost stopped. One of them was there, towering over me, blocking my path. Its shadow stretched across the wall, distorted, as if its body was defying the laws of nature. Its head was tilted to the side, at an impossible angle to its neck, and soft moans came from it. I backed away, stifling a scream. But when I turned, another man appeared behind me. His face was long and pale, inhuman. His eyes were red and pupilless, staring straight at me. His long, thin mouth seemed sewn shut, but it was still open, emitting a murmur that sounded like the whisper of 1,000 voices. I almost cried. All escape routes were blocked. They did not rush to attack, just stood there, surrounding me with their terrifying presence. I could feel the tension in the air, as if these creatures were savoring my fear bit by bit. My throat was dry, my head spinning with despair. Suddenly, the strobe lights overhead seemed to activate, casting strange shadows on the walls. Taking advantage of the moment when the light distracted them, I dashed through a small gap between the two giants. One of their long hands reached out, just inches away from me, but I dodged it in time. I dashed toward the escalator, the only way out. Their footsteps echoed behind me. Even on stilts, they moved impossibly fast. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel their cold breath on the back of my neck. My foot slipped on the escalator, but I was quick to stand, dashing to the top before they caught up. As I stepped out of the main exit, the streetlights outside greeted me. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But no, I was wrong. The silhouettes of the giants still loomed in the shopping center, standing silently behind the large glass doors, staring outside. I felt like they were laughing at me, a twisted smile, devoid of any humanity. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I kept running, racing through the dark streets of Brisbane. The patter of rain on the asphalt mingled with the thud of my footsteps. But even though I was far from the mall, I still didn't feel safe. Something was following me. Thick darkness enveloped the deserted streets. I glanced over my shoulder, seeing nothing. But the rattling kept chasing me, getting louder, faster. I tried to scream, but no one appeared. The city, at this hour, felt as if it had been taken over by these creatures. As I approached the hotel, I began to feel a little relieved. But that relief quickly disappeared when I saw a tall figure standing in the lobby. The long legs, the tilted head, and that unmistakable red gaze. It was waiting for me. I turned around, intending to run away. But as soon as I turned around, a long, cold arm grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, feeling sharp nails digging into my flesh, pulling me back. Everything around me seemed to spin. My whole body was lifted off the ground, suspended in the air. A twisted smile appeared right in front of me, and whispers echoed in my head. "We found you." I don't remember how I managed to escape. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was luck. But I struggled, kicked, and somehow I managed to free myself from those horrible arms. I ran for the hotel door, slammed my key card into the scanner, and ran inside. The door slammed shut behind me, leaving the giants standing outside, staring through the glass. They didn't come in. They just stood there, motionless, but their eyes seemed to pierce right through me. I felt like they were smiling, a creepy, haunting smile that signaled that this wouldn't be the last time I saw them. That night, I sat motionless by the hotel window, staring down at the empty streets. The giants were still there, wandering through the alleys, their long legs dragging the ground, their twisted smiles still plastered on their faces. I didn't know who they were, where they came from, or why they were here. But I knew one thing for sure: they weren't human. It was a cold, dreary winter afternoon in 1999, and my brother Matt and I were preparing for a camping trip in the North Queensland outback. We were hurtling through the dusty roads in his old Ford Laser, searching for something special among the rugged hills. Our destination was Flat Rock, a place Matt had mentioned many times but had never taken me to. He described it as mysterious and haunted, marked by a distinctive Y-shaped ghost gum tree on the side of the dirt road. I remember vividly the moment my brother shouted, "There it is," and pointed to the eucalyptus tree. The tree stood tall, its branches drooping, as if it were guarding an invisible gate to somewhere far away. A strange feeling permeated the air from that moment, as if the land was inviting us, but hiding a secret we shouldn't know. We drove down to the riverbank, where pale rocks stretched out and the still water reflected the overcast sky. There was an eerie feeling in the air, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. The rocks, their colors drained away, created a scene that was both familiar and foreign. But the excitement of youth overshadowed any doubts, and I quickly set up camp with Matt. We pitched our tent by the river, lit a small fire, and sat together as the night wore on. Jokes, family memories, and scary stories were told by the flickering light. But the mood changed when Matt told me about the big cats, legends of giant creatures introduced to the land during the gold rush. They roamed the darkness, he said, preying on everything from animals to humans. Though I tried to act fearless, his story left me with a nameless unease. A light rain began to fall, and we retreated into our tents to escape the bitter cold. I hid in my sleeping bag, trying to put the scary story out of my mind by reading a comic book, but the patter of rain on the roof of the tent and the howling wind outside kept my mind occupied. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a sleep, but a few hours later, a strange noise woke me up. Thunder rumbled outside, followed by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the landscape. I woke up in the dark, a strange sensation coursing through my body. I reached for the small nightlight, but instead my hand touched something cold and hard, like a foot. I froze, not daring to move, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Just a deep indentation in the sand, right at the edge of the tent. Footsteps began to sound outside, slow, heavy, and deliberate. I whispered to Matt to wake him. My brother woke up with a confused look on his face, but immediately recognized the danger when he heard the strange noise. "It's not a big cat," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "You made that up." Panic began to rise inside me. If it wasn't a big cat, then what was lurking outside? We sat motionless in the tent, listening to the footsteps approaching from many directions. Eerie rattling and groaning sounds filled the air, as if they were communicating. A flash of lightning lit up the scene outside, and I saw them, tall, pale creatures with gaunt bodies and glowing, pupilless eyes. They walked on long legs, claws scraping the ground with terrifying screeches. Matt motioned for me to be quiet and get ready to run to the car. He counted down on his hand, and when we reached the last number, we dashed out of the tent and ran toward the car. The creatures turned to look at us, their sharp eyes following our every step in the darkness. There was a long hiss, and they started moving. The car was right in front of us, but when we got inside, the engine refused to start. Matt frantically turned the key, but only a dry screech came out. Outside, the creatures had closed in, surrounding the car. One of them leaned over, placing a pale hand on the windshield, claws lightly scratching the surface, making a chilling sound. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, just prayed that they would leave. The car was silent, complicit in the deathly atmosphere. Matt kept turning the key, but the engine only made a dry hum. Outside, pale creatures surrounded the car, long, skinny legs dragging on the ground with an eerie sound. I huddled in the passenger seat, trying to keep quiet. One of them leaned closer, staring down at me through the window. Its eyes, large and empty, seemed to pierce my soul. I sensed it was trying to say something, but no human voice came out. Instead, a strange series of sounds escaped its throat. Squeaks, gurgling, and what sounded like a distorted child's giggle. Matt looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. "We have to get out of here," he whispered, "or they will get in." I didn't know if the creatures could break the windows, but the way they stared and clawed at the glass, I didn't want to find out. Matt tried one last time, gripping the key and turning it. Suddenly, there was the sound we'd both been waiting for, the engine roaring to life. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that was quickly replaced by fear as the creatures began to move closer. Matt didn't hesitate. He stomped on the gas, the wheels spinning, crunching the gravel beneath him, and he took off at breakneck speed. In the rearview mirror, I saw them chasing, their long, skinny legs skimming the ground like giant insects. One of them, larger and faster than the others, was almost right behind the car. I screamed as it jumped onto the hood, its skinny body slamming into the metal. Matt shook the wheel, trying to unbalance it. The car lurched, and I heard the creature's claws scrape the hood, making sharp, screeching noises. Finally, with a hard turn of the wheel, Matt sent the creature skidding off the car, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The other creatures stopped and turned to face their comrade, eyes glowing in the darkness. We didn't stop to watch any longer. The car hurtled along the dirt roads, its tires kicking up dust behind us, as if the fine grains of sand could stop whatever was chasing us. I could only tighten my seatbelt, my heart pounding in my chest, praying that we would escape this hellish land. When we reached the Y-shaped eucalyptus tree, things got even stranger. A strong wind blew through, rustling the dry leaves on the ground. Matt slowed down, looking around in confusion. "What the?" he muttered. The road ahead of us, which should have led back to town, now seemed to stretch on forever, shrouded in a misty haze. I couldn't make out any familiar landmarks, as if we had just entered a completely different place. "Just keep going," I yelled, afraid that if we stopped, the creatures would catch up. Matt nodded and stepped on the gas, but the air in the car was stifling. The wind whistled through the windows, mixed with a distant, eerie chuckle. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, we saw the first streetlights of the town. Relief flooded us, but it didn't last long. Matt slammed on the brakes as something appeared in the middle of the road. It was a man, his clothes ragged, his eyes vacant. He pointed at us, muttering something we couldn't make out. Matt honked, but the man didn't move. Matt finally decided to swerve and drive around him. As we passed, I glanced at the man through the window. His eyes were empty, and his lips were still moving in gibberish. I didn't know who he was, but his presence made everything worse. We made it home safely the next morning, exhausted and terrified. Matt and I didn't speak of that night again for years, as if just mentioning it would bring back the creatures. But I never forgot it. The hollow eyes, the creepy noises, and the feeling that we'd entered another world where normal rules didn't apply. To this day, I still wonder what those creatures were. Were they part of our world, or did they come from somewhere far away? And why did they let us go? Those questions will never be answered, but one thing is certain. I will never return to Flat Rock, and I recommend that you do the same.